And I must say hello there to everybody listening to the audio podcast. Wow, my hair is a fright. Anyway, welcome to May 8th, Friday, May 8th, 2026. It is the 81st anniversary of Victory in Europe Day. That was also known as VE Day for short. And it commemorates the now 81st anniversary of the end of the Second World War in Europe, when we defeated Nazi Germany and its allies such as Italy, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Finland, and so on and so forth. So today also marks the end of the 1942 Battle of the Coral Sea, with the sinking of the USS Lexington, our first aircraft carrier lost in the Second World War, but that happened in the Pacific 3 years earlier. Today, though, we're going to be talking about VE Day, and wow, there's a lot to talk about, really. It all began, of course, 4:47 a.m. on September 1st, 1939, in the harbor at Danzig, Poland. Well, it wasn't Poland at that point. It was considered a free city. It was part of a little corridor of land that had been carved out from Germany as a result of the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I. The free city of Danzig basically is what I'm talking about here, and it's now known as Gdansk in Poland. Back then, of course, as I said, it was called Danzig. Sorry for a rocky start here this morning. It's just barely past 10 a.m. and I'm useless until 10, so I'm just now getting geared up. But it started at 4:47, 4:48, depending on who you listen to, a.m. on September 1st, 1939, when the German battleship, Schleswig, let's see if I can pronounce this right, the Schleswig-Holstein fired the first shots at the Polish military depot at Westerplatte, and was followed, of course, by a massive ground invasion by nearly, I think it was 1.5 million German troops, against an army of a little bit smaller size. The Poles, as Time Life books put it in the book describing this attack, Blitzkrieg, which was volume 2 of its World War II series, said that the Poles had a decent army by the standards of 1920, which was, of course, the last time they fought, when the Soviet Union tried to invade them, but the Poles broke their codes in August of that year, just as several Soviet armies approached the capital of Warsaw, and they managed to not only defeat the Soviets, they routed their armies and drove them out. And I think that created a permanent grudge with Joseph Stalin, because of the way he treated the Poles from that point on. Whenever he had the opportunity to basically crap on them, he did. And anyway, that's another story for another podcast. But basically, the war started with those first shots in Danzig, and it lasted 2,077 brutal days. Now, it's estimated that somewhere between 15 and 40 million people lost their lives in the European part of the war alone. It doesn't count what happened in the Pacific. It doesn't count, necessarily what happened in North Africa and in other places around the world. Just in the ETO, the European Theater of Operations, 15 to 40 million died. Let's break that down real quick. Anywhere from 16 to 20 million Soviets died, and those weren't all military. A lot of those were civilians. You had 5 million approximately German deaths, and then you had millions of other deaths from other things, such as the Holocaust, which was 11 million. Now, some of that 11 million came from the 20 or so million, 16 to 20 million that died that were in the Soviet Union. But all told, let's break it down. Let's say that the Soviets only, and this is still a staggering figure, let's say the Soviets only lost 15 million people, and of those 15 million, 5 million of them were Holocaust victims. Then that still leaves another 6 million from other places, such as, the Hungarian Jewish population. The Jewish population in most places in Europe were absolutely decimated by what the Germans did. But if you have 11 million in the Holocaust, another 11 from the Soviets, another 5 from the Germans, that's 27 million right there. Not counting all of the other combat and civilian casualties of the war. So it was a horrible, bloody affair, and it lasted almost 6 years. there was a relatively quiet period after Germany overran Poland at the end of September. So we're gonna give you a little bit of recap and a lead up to the end of the war. And I'm speaking extemporaneously, so forgive me if I get some minor stuff wrong, but I'm going to do my best here. Basically, around the 27th of September 1939, after 4 weeks, and after the Soviets invaded eastern Poland on the 17th of September, Warsaw capitulated. Now, the Polish government itself did not surrender, to my knowledge. The military continued to fight on. A lot of the troops fled south into Hungary or Romania, and managed to find their way to Britain in some numbers to form the Free Polish Forces, and they ended up having an armored division among other forces that fought in Europe later on in the war. They landed in France after D-Day, as a matter of fact. And they also, of course, had the famous paratrooper brigade under General Sosabowski that dropped in the second lift of troops at Arnhem during the Battle of Operation Market Garden. That was in September 1944. So I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. But there was a relatively quiescent period after the fall of Warsaw that led up to April 8th or 9th, 1940. April 8th, the British finally started mining the waters around Norway in an attempt to interdict German iron ore shipments coming from ports such as Narvik in northern Norway, coming from Sweden to Narvik, that helped supply the German war effort. Well, the very next day, the Germans invaded Norway. It was something that had been planned for quite some time. And an interesting little facet of the Norway invasion is it was planned by one man in one afternoon using basically a Michelin travel map. It took him about 5 hours to plan out the invasion of Norway. And to be honest, it was just a sketch out of a plan, and of course they fleshed it out in more detail later. To be honest, considering the German losses in their navy in particular, in the battles around Narvik, among others, the sinking of the Blucher in Oslo Fjord right outside the capital on the morning of the invasion, it reflected a lack of planning. It did, but the Germans, unfortunately, were still successful in invading and occupying Norway, and Norway remained occupied until the very end of the war. A month later, on May the 10th, Case Green, the German invasion of the Low Countries took place. Hold on a minute, I'm looking at something here. Just making sure I got that operation name right. No, it wasn't Case Green. Was it Case Yellow? I don't know. I'm sorry to do this. It was Falgeld. Case Yellow was the German invasion of France and the Low Countries in May of 1940, and the plan went through several permutations until Hitler saw the one that was proposed by, I believe it was Erich von Manstein, that involved the Sichelschnitt, or sickle cut, through the Ardennes forest and west through Sedan, France, over to the English Channel, which would then cut off the British Expeditionary Force and the French armies north of the sickle cut, and of course quicken the conquest of the West. Holland capitulated on May the 14th. Belgium capitulated on May the 28th. Luxembourg was basically overrun in a day or so. It's a very tiny little duchy that's nestled between France, Belgium, and Germany. And then, of course, by around the 23rd of May, the Germans had achieved the objectives of that first part of the operation, in that they had cut the BEF off, along with a couple of French armies to the north, of a line basically running from the German border to Sedan to Abbeville, which is a city along the Channel coast between, I want to say, between Dieppe and Bologna, there at the that little cape there. But anyway, so what you had happen then was the majority of the British forces in Western Europe on the continent were trapped in a pocket and being surrounded and being pounded by the German Luftwaffe and, of course, the artillery. But Hitler made his first significant mistake, aside from starting the war in the first place. He made his first significant mistake in that campaign by ordering his troops to halt and not finish destroying the Allied armies in that pocket around the city of Lee, and then stretching to the coast around, of course, the port city, which everyone now knows the name Dunkirk. Well, he did it to give his troops a rest, supposedly, because there still had to be the campaign to the south, and they still had to cross several rivers and still had to deal with taking Paris and cleaning out other parts of France. So he said, we'll give them a rest. And meanwhile, this kind of worked hand in hand with his second major mistake. He listened to Hermann Goering one too many times. More than one, actually, but this was the first time Hermann Goering overpromised and underdelivered. He said that the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, would defeat and destroy the Allied forces in the Dunkirk pocket all by themselves, so he'd be able to handle it. Well, in the meantime, on May the 10th, Winston Churchill, who had been First Lord of the Admiralty since September the 1st the previous year, his appointment to significant positions coincided with major German attacks, the two times that had happened during the war. He had asked around, knowing the plight of the BEF and the French forces, asked around whether or not the Admiralty might be able to find a way to evacuate the troops from Dunkirk. And thus was launched Operation Dynamo around the 25th or 26th, I want to say, of May, in which pretty much anything that could float and had a motor was not commandeered, not press-ganged, but urged and semi-volunteered to join in the effort to evacuate Allied forces from Dunkirk. And that operation began on May 26th, I want to say, lasted until June the 4th, at which point over 330,000 BEF personnel and a number of French troops had been evacuated to Britain. It was an amazing period of time in terms of the weather, because the channel stayed calm, which was an absolute necessity, because what you had as a large portion of the so-called fleet that evacuated this force, they were privately owned fishing boats, a lot of them, little trawlers and this or that, and pleasure craft, and a lot of them were just absolutely filled to the gunwales with troops, to the point where they were barely seaworthy on calm, placid seas, and had there been wind and heavy waves, the operation absolutely would not have succeeded. So things like that, in my opinion, kind of make you believe in God, because I think that's, I don't believe really in coincidences. So with the evacuation of the BEF, that meant that the Germans could then turn their forces south and finish the conquest of France. I think Paris fell on, I believe, June the 14th. The Germans then proceeded along the coast of the Channel and then the Bay of Biscay down to the Pyrenees Mountains, where France borders Spain, and occupied all of that territory along the coast so as to construct bases for their submarine fleet to continue the battle that had begun on September 1st against the Royal Navy by the U-boat force. Over the course of the next few months, the Battle of Britain took place, in which Germany tried to subdue Britain and set the stage for an amphibious invasion across the English Channel. But the Royal Air Force, as everyone knows, stood firm, and despite horrendous losses, managed to inflict twice as many on the Luftwaffe and deny them air superiority. Air superiority being necessary to help get the absolute ramshackle, cobbled together, improvised German invasion force across the English Channel. Having seen some of the photos and seeing some of the compositions of the forces that were going to attempt to land several German divisions across the Channel on British soil, they absolutely had to have air superiority, because if they didn't, then the RAF and the Royal Navy would absolutely chop that little fleet into pieces. With the failure of the planning of Eagle Day, Aldertag, and days around it, which, again, was Goering overpromising and underdelivering, It led to the defeat, I guess you would call it, of the Luftwaffe and the delay, the postponement, that's the word I'm looking for, the postponement of Operation Sea Lion, the German landings in southern Britain, and the postponement ended up becoming a permanent cancellation. It never took place, obviously. So since 1066 AD, Britain has not been invaded successfully by sea, and the Germans wouldn't even try it because they didn't really meet the conditions they needed in order to make it happen. So Britain then stood alone from that fall onward. Now in October of 1940, June 10th, by the way, Italy, who was the Germans, I guess you'd call them an ally. They weren't much of one. Poorly led, poorly equipped, low morale, and the national infrastructure of Italy was not suited to a long war either. Anyway, Il Duce, Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy, decided that, well, he's not going to let Germany get all the laurels. So on June 10th, he declared war on France and Britain and joined Germany's side. Well, they didn't contribute a whole lot. The Italian offensive into the French Alps along the border between those two nations was repulsed with heavy losses, and they didn't really accomplish a damn thing, truth be told. But moving forward in October that year, Il Duce wasn't happy with being out of the limelight, and so he decided to attack Greece from Albania, which he had occupied in March of 1939. Like the invasion of France back in June, the invasion of Greece was an utter frickin' fiasco, and the Greeks actually not only stopped the Italian attack cold, they pushed Italian forces back into Albania in some areas, and the following spring, Hitler had to come to his rescue. Well, in the meantime, in the Balkans, just north of Yugoslavia, used to lie, along the Adriatic Sea coast, a nation called Yugoslavia. It was cobbled together from Serbia, Montenegro, Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, several different quasi-nations, and made into one independent state, again, as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. And it was a polyglot nation similar to the Habsburg Empire of Austria-Hungary that existed before World War I. It was just in a different location and a different composition, but it was still a little bit similar in that regard, not in terms of its rulership or anything like that, but it was a slapdash affair. Well, the government was overthrown by a pro-Axis element in, I want to say, very early March 1941, at which point the British responded and sponsored a pro-Allied coup, which then overthrew the government in the other direction, making it friendly to the Allies rather than to the Nazis. Now, this had multiple effects. One, it convinced Hitler that he absolutely had to clean out the Balkans. And two, it postponed his huge operation Barbarossa, which was the German invasion of the Soviet Union, whom they were allies with at the time, that was set originally for early May 1941. Well, with the involvement of forces in Operation Punishment, as it was called, the invasion of Yugoslavia, and then the invasion of Greece, it's pushed back the German timetable from Barbarossa by about 6 weeks. Those were a very crucial 6 weeks, as we'll learn in a moment. Now, in April, the Germans took about 6 days in conquering Yugoslavia and made very short work of that part of the campaign. The Greek campaign took a little over a month, maybe a month and a half, you'd have to call it, and by the 15th, I want to say, of May, the Nazi flag unfortunately flew over the Acropolis in Athens, capital of Greece, the Allies having been pushed off the continent again, and this time retreating to the large island of Crete, 150 or so miles south and slightly east of the capital of Athens. Hitler had another one of his bright ideas, taking from the successes of glider-borne troops and attacking the fortress of Eben Emael in Belgium in 1940. He decided to launch an even larger airborne assault on Crete in order to push the Allies off that island. And on May 20th, 1941, the Fallschirmjäger, the hunters from the sky, the German paratroopers, descended on Crete in large numbers at several locations, and a 2-week-ish long battle ensued there, at which point the Allies... I won't get into basically the crucial fighting around, I think it was Retimo Airfield, that led to a turn in the momentum, because of the German paratroops took horrendously high casualties in this fight. So high that Hitler didn't launch another significant, anything near this size, airborne operation for the rest of the war. It absolutely wrecked the Fallschirmjäger Corps. But they were still successful, the Pyrrhic victory, pushing the Allies off of the island of Crete and preventing them from using it as an unsinkable aircraft carrier to launch aerial attacks on places such as the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, which were the largest European source of oil for Adolf Hitler. Of course, there were other sources of oil to the east, and that's where we're headed with this. On June 22nd, that morning, approximately 3 million German Allied troops, invaded the Soviet Union along a front that stretched quite literally from the Black Sea to the Baltic Sea, and then also included the Finnish-Soviet border, that having been moved back a little bit by the Soviet-Finnish War of 39 to 40 that lasted a little over 3 months, in which the Finns were almost winning at one point, but got crushed by overwhelming Soviet numbers, despite inflicting horrible casualties on Stalin's forces. But the Finns had joined as allies of the Germans between basically the end of that war and the start of Barbarossa, as had the Hungarians, the Romanians. Bulgaria did too, but they didn't send any forces to attack the Soviet Union, to my knowledge. I may be wrong about that. But they remained an Axis, a satellite power, basically, of the Axis, and firmly allied with Germany. So on June 22nd, 150-odd German and associated divisions, including, I think it was 19 panzer divisions, invaded the Soviet Union, and over the course of the next couple of months won success after success. Aside from the fortress city of Brest-Litovsk right along the German-Soviet border, holding out for a month, the Germans pretty much had unfettered advances in a lot of other areas, penetrating as far as 58 miles, I believe, the very first day of the attack. There were some minor places, some minor instances, such as at Rossini, where a single heavy Soviet KV-2 tank held off an entire German division for a day or so, but eventually that one tank was disabled and the advance continued. The German surprise was so complete, despite all the warnings that Stalin had received from spies and defectors and intelligence, and from seeing German reconnaissance planes overfly Soviet airspace and penetrate hundreds of miles into the Soviet Union. He ignored all these warnings and was thus taken by utter surprise on the morning of the 22nd, and retreated to his dacha outside Moscow for a week and a half. And I don't know if he lost himself inside a liquor bottle or what the case was, but he basically ran off and hid in his vacation home, pretty much, until some of the Soviet higher-ups went to him and asked him to come back and lead the Soviet Union in the war against the Nazi invaders. And he told them afterward that when they came to see him, he thought they were going to arrest him. And that's an interesting what-if scenario, by the way, for anybody who wants to work on an alternative history of Barbarossa and the Russian-German War. What would have happened had Stalin been arrested rather than asked to continue to lead the Soviet Union? He had his high command and his cabinet, the Politburo, so whipped that apparently the thought never crossed their minds. So yeah, that's what you call total control. I've got this one little strand of hair that's sticking out, and I know I'm fugly, but daggone, dude. Anyway, the fall of Kiev, capital of Ukraine, which of course is now its own separate nation with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, took place in mid-September. The Germans overran Minsk, the capital of Belarus, within a couple of weeks of the opening of the war, overran the Baltic states, starting in the south as Lithuania, Latvia, then Estonia. For some reason, I always get them in the other order, but overran the Baltic states and threatened the city of Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg. But Hitler had decided, apparently, not to take the city by storm, but to rather starve it out, because that's what he does. So, with the fall of Kiev by a pincer encirclement from the north and the south, it trapped the largest number of armies taken prisoner during the war, to my knowledge. The official number I've seen is 665,000. I've also seen estimates of as high as 1 million Soviet troops captured in the Kiev pocket. There were a lot of other smaller encirclements of 20,000, 100,000, 80,000 here and there. But the Kiev pocket encirclement was by far the largest, and was a huge defeat for the Soviet army. General Kirponos, who commanded troops defending against it, was caught in the pocket and ended up dying fighting his way out. But Semyon Budyonny, the incompetent ass-kiss, who was an old buddy of Stalin from back in the Russian Civil War days, largely escaped blame for being utterly incompetent in the defense of Kiev and was shunted off to some other position in the Red Army that didn't involve his having any direct control over units in combat anymore, basically. But as the fall began, the mud began. And with the coming of rain in the Soviet Union, there were at the time very few actual paved roads in the Soviet Union, and because of it, everything was a dirt track. Well, the soil in Ukraine and Belarus and the Baltic states is very fertile, and the topsoil is also rather deep. It's my understanding, I don't know if this is true, but it's my understanding the topsoil in Ukraine is something like 6 feet deep. Well, imagine if it's just regular old dirt and it gets pounded with 5-6 days of rain. It becomes a swamp, and mechanized troops, even people on foot, have a heck of a time trying to negotiate that. So the Rasputitsa, as it's called, slowed the German advance to a crawl. And then when things froze, the Germans realized, oh, wow, we were preparing for a 6-week campaign to knock out the Soviets. We're now 4 months in, snow's starting to fall, and little did the Germans know that they were about to face the worst Russian winter on record since records started to be kept in the 1820s. Now, the winter of 1939 to 40 was the worst winter in half a century. So 2 years later, the winter of 41-42 says, hold my beer, or vodka in this case, and proceeded to be far, far worse. Now, by the first week of December, the Germans had come to within darn near shooting distance of the Kremlin inside Moscow city center. There were reconnaissance units that could actually see the tops of the spires of the Kremlin, supposedly from about 10 or 12 miles away. This happened by, I want to say, December 4th, as a last-ditch operation by the Germans in late October into November called Operation Typhoon was launched. And basically Hitler threw everything he could at Moscow in an attempt to knock out the capital. Now, again, we can debate over whether or not that should have been attempted earlier, but I'm kind of glad that it did happen when it happened, obviously, because of the way the war ended. But by December 4th, the Germans had reached their farthest point of penetration. Now, meanwhile, in Asia, working at, what was it, the German, he was a journalist, officially. A fellow named Ricard Sorge was a Soviet spy working in Tokyo. Now, he spoke, I believe, Russian, German, and Japanese. And he was working for Stalin and communicated one among the many things that he communicated to Stalin, he communicated one huge, crucial piece of intelligence that I think was really a war-winning piece of intelligence. He informed Stalin that the Japanese had decided they would not be renewing their hostilities with Russia. Back in the summer of 1939, along the Khalkhin River in Mongolia, Soviet and Japanese forces had clashed for a number of weeks, and the Russians, quite frankly, cleaned the Japanese clocks. They kicked their ass. And the Japanese and Soviets made a peace arrangement on August 31st, 1939. The day after that was when Hitler invaded Poland. So, as one little war began, a bigger one was starting up. Well, the Japanese did not have the equipment. They did not have the troops. They did not have the necessary things to defeat the Soviets. So they decided that they would not be attacking them again, and realizing that the resources that they needed as a result of an oil embargo by America, they needed to drive south into Sumatra, in the rest of Indonesia proper, what was called the Dutch East Indies, Borneo, Celebes. And of course, if you're going to take these areas out to exploit the resources, you've got to remember there's 800 or so islands in the middle of all that called the Philippines that was an American possession. So if you're going to overrun all of those islands to exploit the resources, thereby starting a war with the British and the Dutch, you're probably going to have to attack the Americans as well. Well, in order to attack the Americans, the doctrine of the Japanese was to launch a large surprise attack, and then hopefully it would knock America out of the war long enough for them to consolidate their conquests and to begin to exploit those resources, specifically oil, rubber, tin, manganese, all kinds of things that were necessary to keep a war machine running, especially oil. Oil was the huge thing that Japan needed the most because they were running out. Well, in order to knock out the American fleet, they had to attack Pearl Harbor. Problem with that was Pearl Harbor's harbor itself was considered too shallow for aerial launch torpedoes. So if you're going to attack it with air forces, which is what they were planning to do by using aircraft carriers, something had to be done. Well, somebody came along with the idea of putting wooden fins on the back of the long-range torpedoes that the Japanese were using to make that attack. They worked, and in the 50-foot harbor of Pearl, well, we all know what happened to Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Okay, but between the 4th and the 7th, between the Pearl Harbor attack and the Germans' farthest point of penetration, Ricard Sorgier's intelligence came into effect, in that Stalin had ordered a massive movement of troops from Siberia and eastern Russia west to fight the Germans, including crack units such as the 32nd Infantry Division. These are men who were trained, lived and breathed the cold weather. They're from frickin' Siberia. Some of the coldest places on Earth are in Siberia. There's one area in Mongolia, I believe, where during the course of a calendar year, the temperature can fluctuate from the 90s Fahrenheit down to almost negative 100 Fahrenheit, almost a fluctuation of 200 degrees. These men are used to changes in the climate, especially being able to manage a cold spell. And with their felt boots, the Germans wore, leather boots with hobnails in them, and they had a ton of frostbite casualties. I won't tell you in this podcast what the leading German non-combat casualty supposedly was on the Eastern Front in World War II because it's disgusting. Let's just say they had some terrible things happening to them while they were invading. Well, on the 5th of December, Stalin launched a massive counterattack outside of Moscow, among other places, and drove the Germans back. And only by ordering his men to stand fast and die where they stood and fight to the last round did Hitler manage not to have his whole front fall apart. The problem is, with the success of the Standard Die Order in 1941, it made Hitler think that that worked in every event, and because of it, there were a lot of unnecessary standard dies issued later on in the war that took away flexibility from German commanders and thus led them to suffering a lot of defeats that could have been maybe not prevented but mitigated. If you're not allowed to retreat, everything you have is dead. So if you're allowed to retreat, you can at least save some of it to fight another day, and Hitler wasn't big on retreating because of the lessons learned from Napoleon's Grand Army in 1814 in particular. But with December 4th, the Germans' point of farthest penetration basically toward Moscow. December 5th and 6th, the launching of the massive Soviet counterattack, and then December 7th, with Japan declaring war on the United States and attacking us at Pearl Harbor, the Pacific War opened up in earnest. Now, there had already been fighting going on the mainland between China and Japan as far back as 1931. But in 1937, an incident at what was called the Marco Polo Bridge basically gave the Japanese a pretense, which they created themselves, to allow them to invade mainland China and not just Manchuria. And they took a large chunk of eastern China along with a number of ports, one of which, though, was not taken, and that was Hong Kong, because that was a British possession. That fell, I want to say, the day before Christmas, or Christmas Day, 1941, as part of this massive operation that Japan launched that went along with the Pearl Harbor attack. So in the next few months in the Pacific, Japan overran hundreds of little islands and a number of very large ones, booted American forces out of the Philippines, the ones that didn't surrender, and maybe we'll talk about that some other time. I'm not a MacArthur fan, so we won't be giving him a glowing review of how he handled that campaign and of his personal conduct and possible financial aspects of certain things in his involvement in the war. But anyway, by May, basically, of 1942, the Japanese had taken a good portion of New Guinea, Borneo, Celebes, Java, Sumatra, almost all of the Philippines, and a number of other islands, such as Wake Island, which defended itself very rigorously, but fell on December 23rd, despite sinking a Japanese destroyer and inflicting some significant casualties. The Marines there really acquitted themselves well in particular, but Wake Island still fell. And by the first week of May, the Japanese had taken it upon themselves to decide to try to launch an amphibious invasion of Port Moresby, which is in the southeast corner of New Guinea. If successful, that would have pretty much isolated Australia. But America, our code breakers, had gotten wind of it and dispatched two carriers, the Lexington and the Yorktown, to try to turn back the invasion. Well, it was technically successful in that the MO force, Operation MO, the Port Moresby invasion, did not take place, because in the course of the multi-day Battle of the Coral Sea, southeast of New Guinea, while we lost the Lexington, an aircraft carrier, they lost the Shoho, a smaller aircraft carrier. And of course, that's where the term Scratch One Flat Top came from, when on May the 7th, American pilots destroyed the Shoho, and that was what one of the dive bomber pilots, I believe it was, signaled. So with the turning back of the MO invasion force, and with the Doolittle raid on Tokyo on April 18th, when 16 Army B-25s flew from the Hornet to drop bombs on Tokyo, it was really just a token raid. They didn't do any appreciable damage, but they really affected Japanese morale, because the homeland hadn't been attacked in centuries. And this prompted the Japanese to make another change in plans, and decided, the higher command decided to attack Midway. Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, basically staked his reputation on the Midway thing and said, if you don't approve the operation, I quit. Well, after some wrangling with the Army over whose assignment it would be to actually land troops there, and after this and that, it was approved, and that operation took place June 4th through 7th of 1942, and was a disaster for the Japanese, because again, our code breakers had been reading their mail, and along with the damaged Yorktown, the Enterprise and the Hornet intercepted the Japanese force. Now, this wasn't a face-to-face interception. This is a figure of speech, because as with the Coral Sea, the fleets didn't ever actually see one another. Carrier forces engaged. The Japanese lost 4 aircraft carriers in the Battle of Midway, all of them, I believe, on June the 4th, the very first day of the battle. The Kaga, Akagi, Hiryu, and Soryu were all sunk by American dive bombers. The torpedo planes had very little success. 35 of the 41 torpedo planes in Squadrons 3, 6, and 8 from Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet were destroyed, and of one of those squadrons, only one man, George Gay, actually even survived. So the dive bombers did all of the damage in the Battle of Midway, but the Yorktown was destroyed by a Japanese attack. Well, here's what happened with Yorktown. It took serious damage from Japanese attacks and was being towed back to Pearl Harbor by the destroyer Hammond when I-168, a Japanese submarine, saw them moving at just 4 knots and put torpedoes in not just the Yorktown but the Hammond as well. And I think the torpedo that hit the Hammond detonated either a powder magazine or some depth charges, and the Hammond went down pretty quickly, and the Yorktown went down too. They've both, I believe, since been found by people such as, maybe not necessarily him, but people such as Robert Ballard, who do explorations to find old wrecks. But with the victory of the Battle of Midway, the tide had turned, but we didn't really know it yet, and we still had some hard fighting to do in the Pacific. And over the course of the next 3 years, starting with the August 7th American landing of the 1st Marine Division at Guadalcanal, 3 years of island fighting began that took American forces up the Solomon's Chain, British forces across parts of New Guinea, and then in 1945, Borneo, Celebes, Java, and so on and so forth. America worked its way up the Solomons in 1943. In 1944, basically finished off the New Guinea campaign in October of that year, invaded the Philippines. In the meantime, it also invaded the Marianas Islands, as well as the Gilbert Island chain, and hopped from one place to another, gradually whittling away at the Japanese. The Japanese then proceeded in 1944 in June to try to stop our forces when we were landing on Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, and the Battle of the Philippine Sea took place, known now as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, because inexperienced Japanese pilots were shot down by the dozen. I think over 400 were shot down by American forces in just a single day. And it crippled Japanese naval air power from that point on. 4 months later, we destroyed another large portion of the Japanese surface fleet in the battles around what is collectively known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf. That would have been October 23rd, 24th, 25th of 1944. The Japanese lost several heavy cruisers, a couple of battleships, including the Musashi, which was a sister ship of the great 71-ton, 18-inch gun-carrying monster, 71,000-ton, 18-inch gun-carrying monster Yamato, as well as a number of other smaller craft and hundreds of aircraft. Of course, the Japanese would eventually lose the Philippines, but that would take until the summer of 1945. And there were still holdouts on some of these islands that actually stayed holdouts until as late as 1974. But we'll get into that some other time. As 1945 dawned, on June 6th, of course, 1944, the Allies invaded northwestern France and Normandy. The D-Day operation, Operation Overlord, headed by Allied Supreme Commander Ike Eisenhower, who was also the Supreme Commander for the Allied landings in November 1942 through May of 43 in North Africa. The North African campaign, of course, lasting those 6 months and providing a springboard for an Allied landing in Sicily in July of 1943, and then another landing on Italy itself near the port city of Salerno in September 1943. Now, the Italian campaign was a mess because of a combination of supply issues, command issues, the terrain of Italy itself being very mountainous and rugged, and I've got to say it, the determination and defensive capabilities of the Germans. It led to a very long and bloody fight, and although a flanking landing was attempted to get around German lines at the small town of Anzio, which was only, a half hour south of Rome, it didn't do anything, and it didn't really break those lines. It just created a little salient in the German rear that they effectively contained because Allied commanders weren't aggressive enough, and there were some other factors that led to the Anzio beachhead not expanding and being the campaign breaker that Winston Churchill in particular had thought it would be. But on June the 4th, 1944, American forces did actually manage to take over Rome as the Germans retreated north beyond it And then, of course, on June 6th was D-Day. Over the course of about 2 months of heavy fighting in the Normandy hedgerows, the bocage, as it's called, the Allies wore the German 7th and other armies down and eventually broke free, liberating Paris on, August 22nd, 1944. It's either 22nd or 25th. I'm a little fuzzy on that date. But by mid-September, the Allies had made it pretty much clear across France. By mid-September that had happened. Now, in mid-August, Operation Dragoon took place, which were Allied landings in southern France, near the French Riviera, the towns of Caen and Nice in particular, which gave us, the Allies, another foothold in Western Europe. And by the end of October, Allied forces had driven up the Rhone River Valley, among others, and had linked up with troops that had come across from Normandy. In mid-September, British General Sir Bernard Law Montgomery, the winner of a significant land battle at El Alamein in Egypt in 1942 that stopped the German Africa Corps from taking the capital, Cairo, and possibly turning the war into a whole new ballgame, had an idea for an airborne landing along with a ground assault that, if successful, would have flanked the German heavy fortifications along their border called the West Wall or the Siegfried Line, gone around that and plunged into the Ruhr Industrial Valley, which would have crippled German industry and essentially could have brought an end to the war, pundits thought, by Christmas of 1944. It was a 3-division plus airborne drop starting in the south of the 101st American, the 82nd American, and then the 1st British Airborne Divisions along different areas of a 60-odd mile stretch of the German rear. That airborne carpet was called Market, and the ground element was called Garden, wherein the British 30th, among other corps, would drive north, link up with the British at the city of Arnhem, and then basically make a huge sweeping right-hand turn into Germany itself, and thereby win the war. Well, it didn't work. The plan was overly optimistic, and the Allies did not reach the 1st Division at Arnhem before it was overwhelmed and it had to evacuate. To quote Sean Connery's character Roy Urquhart in the movie A Bridge Too Far, I went into Arnhem with 9,000 men, I came out with less than 2. The British 1st Airborne Division was decimated as a result of the battle. 101st and 82nd took some significant losses, and they were moved into the rear for R&R for a few weeks after that, and turns out they would be needed in mid-December because Hitler launched an offensive in the Ardennes forest of Belgium, and a little bit of it was in Luxembourg, called Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, which became known as the Battle of the Bulge. On the morning of December 16th, 1944, a massive German bombardment and ground invasion took place along an 85-mile section of the front that the Allies had kind of unofficially called the Ghost Front. There wasn't a lot of activity there. It's where you sent new or depleted units to rest, refit, and train, and a huge portion of the German assault fell on 2 very unfortunate American divisions. The brand new 106th Infantry Division, it was trained at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, which actually where I went in when I went in the Army, and the 28th Infantry Division, which had been horribly depleted in October fighting and into November in the Hurtgen Forest, an area just north of where the Battle of Bulge took place. Well, the 106th, two of the 3 regiments actually pretty much had to surrender because they were exposed in a salient and cut off and surrounded, and it was the largest surrender of American forces in the European theater in World War II when 2/3 of the Golden Line Division surrendered. The last surviving regiment, I believe it was the 424th, fought on for the remainder of the war, but the damage had been done. The Germans had poked a hole in the Allied lines that was about 80 miles wide at the edges and went probably almost that far west as forces from the 5th Panzer Army and the 6th SS Panzer Armies moved through the Ardennes forest. Now, they could not take one crucial road junction city in Belgium called Bastogne, where I think 6 roads led in, and there's 7 roads led in and 6 led out, as they say. The 101st Airborne and part of, I want to say, the 9th or 10th United States Armored Division were surrounded in Bastogne and held on for over a week, from around December 19th until the day after Christmas, as they were surrounded by, I want to say, 7 German divisions at one point, who continued to exert massive pressure on them. The Germans benefited from bad weather for the first 6 days of this attack, from the 16th to around the 22nd, because, I mean, it was winter in Belgium, and it was very cloudy and overcast, and the Allies had overwhelming air superiority by the spring of 1944, and the planes couldn't fly to help the Allied forces. But on the 22nd or 23rd, the weather cleared, supply drops managed to come through, and Allied air forces began to take their toll on the advancing Germans, shooting up their columns and providing supply and reconnaissance and intelligence, and doing all the things that air forces did in what was then a modern war. By the 26th of December, elements of the 4th Armored Division had linked up with the 101st south of Bastogne, relieving the siege of the city. I will not say that the 101st got rescued, because if you ever had met anyone from the 101st, I met a couple, and you say the word rescue, they would get offended. They did not consider themselves rescued, because one of the paratroopers' famous statements, one of the things you'll hear from a paratrooper is, "We're paratroopers, we're supposed to be surrounded." So you're not going to get anyone from the 101st to ever admit that they got rescued, because in their eyes they weren't being rescued, they were just being relieved. So with that, the offensive stalled, and although it took a month for the Allies to reduce the German bulge back to its original, where the lines were on December 15th, 1944, with the commitment of a massive portion of the German armored force to the Western Front, the Eastern Front, Stalin, of course, had overrun massive portions of German-controlled territory from Stalingrad all the way into Germany proper by January of 1945. Well, the die had been cast, the writing was on the wall, and by late April, Soviet forces had entered Berlin and surrounded the city, and a week-plus siege of the city began, culminating on May 1st with the planting of the Soviet flag over the Reichschancellery building and Hitler shooting himself. Within a week, and that's where we get to May 8th, within a week, the Germans capitulated. And on the early morning hours of May 7th, 1945, at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force Schief, which was the headquarters for Ike Eisenhower and the forces that landed on D-Day, Operation Overlord, basically. The staff was trying to figure out a way to announce the success of things and the end of the war, and everybody was trying to write a quick statement that would be telegraphed out to explain what happened and how it happened, and what was done, and to announce this great big news. Well, this one did it, and that one tried it, and this colonel tried it, and this guy tried it, and so on and so forth. And everybody wrote these glowing things and these lofty pronouncements and all this, highfalutin nonsense. Well, Ike took a piece of paper and wrote simply, "The mission of this Allied force was fulfilled at 0241 local time, May 7th, 1945, with the surrender of the Germans to take effect, I believe, at midnight that night, which would be May the 8th. And that brings us to it being VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, with the capitulation of the German forces. There's your nutshell synopsis. Sorry if it's got a few factual inaccuracies or if I've missed a couple of things, but that's a lot to discuss in 54 minutes. So anyway, there's your VE Day story and the events that led up to it. Millions dead, millions homeless, billions upon billions in property damage. And of course, the future of the world forever altered, and the course of life in Europe set in an entirely different direction. But today marks the day. 81 years ago, where it all officially ended, and there were celebrations in the streets, and the most destructive war in human history began to finally wind down after, 30, at least 20 million deaths just in Europe, and probably that many more in Asia. So there we are, commemorating the end of World War II in Europe today, and give a salute to all of the Allied forces, every country, America, Britain, Canada, France, Australia, all the occupied countries, Poland, Norway, Luxembourg, Denmark, Belgium, Holland, Italy even, because Italy, after the landings in Sicily, and as things progressed into the landings in Italy, Italy capitulated, and only a fascist rump state was created by Hitler that fall. So Italy was considered occupied. Greece, Yugoslavia, so many people in so many countries bled so much and suffered so much and went through so much privation to get the world to the point where was Admiral Dönitz, who had been put in charge of the German Reich by Hitler when Hitler shot himself in the bunker in Berlin on April 30th, signed the surrender documents. It was 2,077 days of war. It was a long time, and it still had another 115 or so to go until the Japanese surrendered in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945, after America dropped 2 atomic weapons on Japan, and after the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria and overran a lot of Japanese territory there, and after Germany had been bombed flat and occupied, and after Japan had been bombed flat, and then after August 15th, occupied in 1945. It was a long war. It was a bloody war. And I offer my thanks, my eternal gratitude to those who led us to that victory, because without it, we have no idea how bad things could have gone. Really, we live in such privileged times as a result of the sacrifices of the people of that era, and for that, I am eternally grateful. And you should be too, and if you're not, you're an asshole. Okay? Let's just say that. So, we're going to wrap up the podcast. This was the special live stream of the VE Day Commemorative. Forgive me for not having a lot of graphics. I'm still a neophyte with the whole computer, podcasting thing, but I did want to get out there and give you a quick monologue on things and give you a little bit of a briefer on what led to VE Day. A lot of campaigning in a lot of places, and I could have talked for 12 hours had I had notes and just given you a lot more detail on a lot of the operations. I didn't really discuss the Battle of the Atlantic. I didn't really discuss the air war over Europe after the Battle of Britain. I hardly at all discussed the Russian front, which is where the Germans suffered 80% of their casualties in the war. I didn't really discuss the North African campaign or even the East African campaign. Didn't really go into anything after the Battle of Midway in the Pacific, except mentioning a few island chains. So there was a lot more to discuss about the war, but that's why I call this the War, Sports, Politics, and Dragons podcast, because in addition to talking about, sports, because I'm a baseball, football fanatic, and politics, and realistically, I'm trying to get a little bit out of politics because the gotcha game is wearing thin on me. Because nobody ever goes to jail. All the crooked and horrible crap that politicians do, and still almost nobody ever goes to jail. It's just infuriating to discuss, and I'm tired of playing the gotcha game. Oh, we got him now, part 456. No, we got him now, part 457. Whatever. But Dragons, of course, is the role-playing aspect of things, and we will be getting into that more. And eventually I will have a full-blown video podcast with graphics and pictures and videos and stuff, but I'm still getting there. Bear with me. And if you are interested in what I do and want to help support me as I grow, because I have grown significantly already, you can support us on Patreon. It's patreon.com/WSPDragons. Our Twitter is at the WSPD podcast. You can help us through Venmo and Cash App. It's WSPD Pod on both of those. And I look forward to interacting with you and hope to have more people on board for all the. It's going to be fun. I'm enjoying this immensely, and to be able to share my gaming ideas in particular. I'm working on a new role-playing game called 1750: The New World, which involves the years in North America just before what historically was the French and Indian Wars here, and they called it the 7 Years' War in Europe. Basically, imagine flintlock muskets and magic and fighting for North America. That's the role-playing game there. Plus, a ton of stuff for Dungeons & Dragons and Battletech and other games is coming down the pike, as well as almost 30 novels, some of which are simply fictional novels set in the real world, and a lot of which are set in the campaign world of Trinith, which I use as the setting for my role-playing game products. So get on board. Again, it's patreon.com/WSPDragons. You can join up for free and get some freebies, or you can become a sponsor for as little as $3 a month. I mean, it's 10 cents a day, and you can get all kinds of good stuff coming down the pike. We're picking up subscribers, and we're getting followers, and we're getting out there. So get on board. I know there are a ton of podcasts out there, but I'd like to think that I've got a really cool skill set because I've got a large amount, I'd like to think, of knowledge of 20th century history in particular, of role-playing games, of sports, because I worked 17 years in the newspaper business as a sports writer, as well as a lot of general life experiences. And if you listen to my podcast, you'll hear funny stories from various jobs I've held over the years and various situations I've been in. So get on board, give the podcast a listen, check out the Patreon, follow us on Twitter, stay here on YouTube, follow us here because we've got more stuff coming out. And thanks again for your time. Thanks for listening to the audio podcast only, if that's what you're listening to. Take care of yourself. Have a great weekend. And, hey, congratulations again to the Allies, and thank God they won. Take care, have a great weekend, and thanks again for tuning in. Bye-bye.